As of 2024, the war in Ukraine continues to resonate globally, shaping the lives of millions. As healthcare providers, we often find ourselves at the intersection of history and healing. This escalation of war has made caring for many of my Ukrainian patients feel different. For example, the day Olena, a recent Ukrainian immigrant, came to my clinic, I noticed her eyes were filled with a mix of apprehension and determination as she sat across from me. As we talked about her health, I noticed a bit of hesitation. It was a guardedness that seemed to run deeper than the usual nerves or anxiety of being in a doctor's visit. Seeing a person like me in a room that's whitewashed, sterile, with not a lot of things that make you feel comfortable. As we transition from her primary complaint to preventive screening, Elena politely declined all my recommendations. I mean, all of them. For vaccines, no. For mammograms, no. For anything that I talked about, she said no, in a little bit more polite way. But her voice was firm, and I sensed an underlying distress and distrust. It's a distress rooted in unfamiliarity with our healthcare system, yes, but also rooted in a deeper history of harm. So I ran through my mental toolkit of approaches. You know, we've all had our different approaches when a tension between what we're recommending and what the person in front of us is willing to do. As I went through the checklist, I said, okay, I could do concrete, specific recommendations, exuding a little bit of confidence. So we know there's a discussion about safety of vaccines because we know they're safe. I thought about leading first with her concerns. What are you worried about with these screenings? Or even more gently, leading with curiosity. Should we talk about this at all? I chose the latter, saying I would love to talk about this more right now. Would you like to? Her response was a confident and resolute no. As I watched her leave, I started questioning myself. There's a part of this conversation about how do you talk to patients or community members when there's hesitancy to talk about preventive screening or specific healthcare recommendations. But I think the bigger question for me was, how do I actually understand the depth of her distress or questioning? Had I grasped the full context of her fight for autonomy, agency, and self-determination? I know these are maybe not the things that you're thinking about from that story, but once you start talking and listening to Ukrainians, that is always a theme. I realized that to truly care for Elena and patients like her, I needed to understand more. I needed to grasp what it meant to be Ukrainian, to have an identity forged through centuries of struggle against external forces, and how that history shapes your relationship with healthcare today.
Hi, I'm Dr. Raj Sundar, a family physician and a community organizer. You're listening to Healthcare for Humans, the show dedicated to educating you on how to care for culturally diverse communities so you can be a better healer. This is about everything that you wish you knew to really care for the person in front of you, not just a body system. Let's learn together.
I'm excited to do this learning and understand the Ukrainian community better with Tamara. She's a professor, nurse, and one of the founders of NASHI Immigrants Health Board. NASHI means our community in both Ukrainian and Russian. Community is at the heart of this board's mission. NASHI Immigrants Health Board, led by healthcare professionals who are themselves part of the Ukrainian community, advocate, empower, and connect Ukrainians with important resources. I think our perspective rooted in both professional healthcare, community health, and personal experience has been an invaluable resource to create this series. In this series, we'll talk about Ukrainian history, their sense of identity, then talk specifically about mental health. We'll spend 2 episodes talking about mental health. But today, we'll focus on the historical context that has shaped the Ukrainian identity and also talk about its impact on health. Because to truly serve NASHI, our community, we must first listen to their story. How might understanding this history change the way you practice medicine? Here's Tamara.
Welcome to the show, Tamara. I'm so glad to have you here with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing right now.
Sure. Thank you for having me on the program. My name is Tamara, and my background is complicated. Both of my parents were, with their families, escaped Ukraine during World War II. So they were refugees for several years and then were able to immigrate to America and restart their lives. The context of that informs the work that I do. Right now, I'm a nurse by trade. I love nursing and being a healthcare provider. I'm also affiliated at the faculty of the University of Washington School of Nursing, where I've taught for many years. But I had the opportunity to become the executive director of an organization named NASHI Immigrants Health Board. The idea originated during the COVID vaccine pandemic, when we knew that the communities in Washington who spoke Ukrainian and Russian were not open to being vaccinated as much as other communities, and there were specific barriers to vaccination. We had some funding from the Department of Health, and I was able to get involved in that work. Then we were able to begin this organization to support the community, to empower them for their own health and needs. And that's still very actively what we do. We have been able to switch gears, and we've specifically had funding to support newly arrived refugees from Ukraine since February 2022 at the start of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you. It's great to have the perfect person to start off this series and to talk about Ukraine and how do we care for Ukrainian immigrants and refugees better. So thank you for coming on again. I think it's helpful to start out talking about the diversity of the country. When we say Ukrainian or Ukraine, we often dismiss the smaller groups of people that are there. And I think it's helpful calling that out. Actually, there's Russians, Hungarians, Romanians, and Greeks, all in a smaller percentage, but there is some diversity of what we say ethnicity there. And there's some diversity of language too. 70% of people consider Ukrainian their first language, while 30% say Russian is their first language. But what would you say, how diverse is that country?
I can give you some information from some of the work we did to create a cultural profile for the Ukrainian community. The main ethnic group in Ukraine are Ukrainians at 78%. There are other groups that are part of the community, and that includes Russians, Belarusians, Moldovans, Bulgarians, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, Roma, and Crimean Tatars. So these are all groups that are comprised into one country and are now facing a current attack and war. In terms of the languages spoken, both Ukrainian and Russian are spoken, and it is not uncommon to hear one person is speaking in Ukrainian and the other answers back in Russian. There are terms created for that combination of languages, and I've heard a lot of people do a disclaimer. The language that's coming out right now is a combined language because many people are taking a political and ethical stance. If Russian was their primary language in Ukraine, they're making a conscious effort to learn Ukrainian and make this their language of choice, rejecting the spoken Russian language. Historically, people who aren't from our community or diaspora, when I was growing up, okay, you're from part of Russia, your family came from Russia. No, Ukraine is a distinct geographic country with a distinct rich history. Oh, so you speak Russian? No, I speak Ukrainian because my parents had to flee. It was during a war where they were not able to make any choices, and they were not able to live in the setting anymore since the Germans were invading and the Soviets were at war. And to them, Ukrainian language was the most important thing for them to instill in us. So that was my first language from birth. And that was something that they did for political and ethical reasons so that we would know that this language exists, that it is important, and it is something that Ukrainians communicate through within Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. There are a lot of nuances in different regions of Ukraine. Different languages and dialects are spoken. You're in Western Ukraine, there will be more conversations strictly in Ukrainian. As you move east through the country, there may be some mixtures of languages and words. And then on the eastern part of Ukraine, more people were primarily speaking Russian, but that again is changing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it's sometimes the only way possible for some cultures to retain their identity, language. It's one thing that you can hold on to wherever you go. I think it's important to acknowledge how important language is in the Ukrainian community because of everything you said in a personal way, but I think as a community as a whole too.
Absolutely.
Let's contextualize some of your family history with the broader history of Ukraine. Every time we talk about a country, we're not going to do justice to everything that's happened. But I think the theme across history was fighting for independence, but also their own identity. Meaning, I think at the beginning of the 19th century, 90% of present-day Ukraine was Russian Empire. During that process of trying to create your own Ukrainian identity, there was a lot of other people trying to say, no, you're actually part of our country or empire. Western Ukraine became part of the Austrian Empire. There's a lot of nuances to this. But the first wave of immigration was around 19th century, where people migrated specifically to the US to work in coal mines and agricultural sector. The next few waves were around the World Wars, which was the First World War, where Ukraine did establish itself as an independent republic. During that time, Western sections of Ukraine were under the rule of Poland, Romania. Ukraine couldn't establish itself its own country because other people were trying to use land and claim their identity. And then World War II, something similar again with Soviet-controlled Ukraine in 1940, affecting the history of Ukraine. And then the fourth wave was around something called the Lautenberg program, which was around family reunification. And then the current wave we're seeing is due to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Tamara, how would you characterize the history of Ukraine in these major waves and what it has meant for the community living here?
Thank you for sharing that information. The history of Ukraine dates back to very much times BC. Ukraine accepted Christianity as their main religion in 988. This is a time period of history that is often shared among Ukrainians in Ukraine and in history books. And in Ukrainian school, which I attended for 12 years as a child and as a teenager, I learned the history of Ukraine and the culture and traditions and all of the things that were making the identity that is Ukrainian. In terms of the waves of immigration to the United States, you're correct. There were 5 waves, and they all had a specific reason for immigration and a specific outcome. As early as the 1870s, people were coming over for agriculture and being able to get an opportunity to do what their skill set and their professions and vocations were back then. So that was one of those reasons people were coming to the United States and to Canada, which has a long history of Ukrainian immigration. In the second wave between 1919 and 1939, there was another immigration, and this was complicated by political and socioeconomic status because Ukraine was being ruled under the Soviets, Russia, and Joseph Stalin. And that is another really important phase in Ukraine's history. Joseph Stalin staged an artificial famine, and basically they estimate between 4 and 10 million people died of starvation, and it was a forced starvation between 1932 and 33. And the name of this event is called Holodomor. It is commemorated now so that people can share this history because it was covered up. And there are movies that describe the story, but it was covered up because the Soviets didn't want it to be known. This is something that I've known from the age of a young child and learned in school. And there's a lot of history through that time that is pretty horrible.
Yeah, I think people, sometimes when they hear this, they think of something that happened in the past, but this is a generation. This memory is alive and in the collective psyche still. And
passed on in different ways, whether explicitly, implicitly, or through the body. If you witness that kind of trauma, and we have an abundance of research that shows now how genes can even be modified when people and communities experience trauma to the subsequent generations.
You're so right. And there are still survivors, and there are some interesting historical podcasts and recordings and books that have been written about these experiences so that people can be witness to that. I wanted to call that one out as a big part of the history of the oppression and wiping out this entire group of people through this method. Then after the wave of World War II, so in 1945 to 1957, there was a big immigration of Ukrainians who were fleeing war. At this point, the term refugee was initiated for this group of people, related to the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. Under Harry Truman's presidency, there were countries experiencing huge exits due to the war. And this was basically what I wanted to point out is immigration is a choice for some people, and they decide to move somewhere else to better their lives, although it's completely still difficult because there are language barriers, cultural barriers, and we know that. But a refugee is forcibly displaced due to some event that is very negative so that they cannot stay in that area in that region. So there's a big distinction in that because refugees come with different issues. But that wave, which was the third wave, was the wave that my parents were in. And I remember hearing from them this label, "You're a DP." In my parents' cases, and this is also recorded and there's movies and there's history books about it, both of my parents' families escaped in their own ways. They have stories that we don't all know the facts to because people didn't want to talk about it. But they both ended up in camps that were run in European countries. So they were in Germany and Austria. They were in what's called DP camps, displaced persons camps. They lived in this huge enclave of other Ukrainians and formed a community. And they lived there for some upward of 4 to 5 years of their life. Wow. That was a phase for them living in this camp. I wanted to call that out because that was a lot of people's experiences until they could get sponsorship to the United States, which took a lot of effort. And luckily, I'm very grateful that they were able to do that. I can talk more about that wave later because I have my parents' stories. But the fourth wave was in the 90s, early 90s to the present, pre-full-scale Russian invasion.
I think 1988 is when the Latin program was officially enacted.
Correct, because that is the wave that was coming over due to religious persecution and people wanting to practice their religion freely without oppression and any negative circumstances. So this was a place where there were many people who were able to come through during this program, and they have families here and religious communities here. So that is a really big part of the Washington Ukrainian community.
The program itself, just to give people a little more context, was through the U.S. refugee admissions program, specifically on religious persecution. So for the Ukrainian community, it was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church members that were part of that program. I think it was enacted also for resettlement of Jews from the former Soviet Union, which is how the political realms aligned to help people in these situations.
And that is correct. There was also a newer faith-based communities where Pentecostal Christianity became a big group in Ukraine. And a lot of folks who wanted to practice that freely ended up here as well. That's another religious sect within the Ukrainian community. Oh, and I also wanted to point out that because I grew up here and I grew up in a religious Ukrainian community, and I don't practice religion heavily, but the way that I can understand it is through my relatives and through people that I know here also, because if people are not allowed to practice, they don't have the freedom to practice what they care about, what means something to them, what is driving them in their lives, then this will be something that's really much more important to them once they are free. And I see this in a lot of Ukrainian communities gathering for specific religious services. And this is something that's so near and dear to them.
Yeah, part revival, part connection that
people and communities have been wanting to do that they couldn't in the places they were. I think witnessing that can be beautiful. We went through 4 waves. The 5th wave is current right now, which is, I think, February 2022 when Russia launched a military invasion of Ukraine. Some people think that's when it started, but actually there was a war going on since 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Could you talk a little bit more about this wave? And again, because it's current, so what we call right now is invasion, not a new war, because there's been a war happening.
And before I talk about that phase, I want to bring attention to the time when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became free and democratic. The Soviet Union began to collapse in the late 80s, early 90s. Ukraine established its independence on August 24th, 1991. This is a huge holiday in Ukraine and all over the world. People could celebrate because they were going to be able to experience that freedom of expression, that freedom of not being oppressed by another group, and be able to develop themselves as this identity, as this country that everyone's wanted. There were huge celebrations throughout that time period, and it is a national holiday. There are festivals, celebrations. People are so proud that was the phase for a prolonged period of time. And unfortunately, that ended when the 2014 invasion began, and there was no longer that same feeling. Because of the history we've been talking about, and there's so much more complex history, that time period is just a beautiful thing. Those 30 years of independence allowed people to evolve into the way that a truly democratic country can exist and how valuable that is. So that's why this current war is so tragic and heartbreaking to the people who've experienced that.
Thank you for anchoring on not just the deficits of a community, if we talk about wars and the waves, but the beauty. I appreciate that when you talk about, hey, actually, Ukraine and the community has been present way before the waves of immigration. In this 30 years, they did have a chance to truly have a national identity. And I'm sure people have memories of that and hold on to it.
Yeah, and I can say that since my parents taught us all the history, for us, it was a pretty amazing time because we visited Ukraine while it was still under the Soviet Union and then visited afterwards. So I was able to see the differences and the similarities. But the people that I had met who I've interacted with at NASHI Immigrants Health Board and friends and family that I have who are younger, they know Ukraine as that place. So we have a lot of discussions around how can you go to this place where you were living well and happily and had resources and had so many creativity to have this happen is really traumatic.
Yeah. Okay. Should we talk about the last current wave right now? What do you think?
Perfect. I can give some information around the experiences that our organization has had since we've had an influx of Ukrainians coming into the United States and specifically coming to Washington State. When the full-scale Russian invasion began on February 24th, 2022, there was preparation already because people were already feeling the conflict building through on the media. People were watching that as well, who had the opportunity to come as a temporary parolees to the United States. So there was a group of those. But then after that date, we started seeing extremely high numbers of people coming into the United States because they were fleeing war. This was something that I imagine was more on people's minds than all the history of Ukraine that others who aren't Ukrainian do not know, because this was broadcast in the social media spheres. Washington is one of the states that accepts the largest amounts of Ukrainians, and that's for a few specific reasons. In one of the articles through the migration policy websites, it's quoted almost half of Ukrainian immigrants lived in 3 states from 2015 to 2019. The highest percentage were situated in the state of New York. California is number 2 and Washington's number 3. Cook County in Illinois, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and King County, Washington account for 31% of the Ukrainian population in the United States. That is something I can really connect to because my parents and their diaspora settled in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the Northeast part of our country, and those communities grew and grew. There were also people who ended up in the Midwestern regions, Ohio, Chicago, and then the western part of the United States, especially Washington and California, was seeing those numbers rising. So the people who were fleeing war were going to connect with family in those areas so that they could be sponsored as refugees through Uniting for Ukraine. And the facts show that has happened. And the biggest areas of immigration of that time are those top 4 states: New York, Illinois, Washington, and California. And now I know for a fact that the Ukrainians who came to Washington were now at around 21,000 Ukrainian refugees who've been accepted to Washington through Uniting for Ukraine. And I don't think people realize those numbers, that Washingtonians who aren't Ukrainian may not realize that is a large number of people, and they are all assimilating into these communities. And King County is one of the biggest areas, also in Eastern Washington and Spokane, and then some other regions. But the core areas are the King, Snohomish, and Pierce counties.
Thank you. I think we have some of the foundational history components for listeners. We can continue to talk about what does it mean to care for the community. Is there anything else that you would add?
I want to speak to the resilience of Ukrainian people. Having gone over very briefly some of these historical points, seeing all of these generations and waves of immigrants and refugees and meeting people who are experiencing this now, it solidifies this resilience, this strength, this hope that Ukrainians bring, that they basically is in their fiber of being, and the pride that they have in who they are, which rings true in every situation that I see with the Ukrainians that I interact with within this work and personal spheres. It's something that's indescribable. People want to continue hoping, fighting, protesting things that are causing this oppression and this misunderstanding of who Ukrainians are. They will never give up.
It's very important for people to understand, not to overly focus on the deficit perspective of community, which I think we tend to do a lot, especially when there's been so much community suffering, but realizing also the strengths and the resiliency of communities. Thanks again, everyone, for joining me on another episode of Healthcare for Humans. If you liked this episode, as always, my ask to you is please share it with one other person, and go to healthcareforhumans.org to sign up to be part of the community. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.